Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we'd like to dig deep into great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, things that you can kind of base your whole life on, cosmologies and cosmogonies, theories of everything, grand unified theories, earth-shattering discoveries, magnum opuses and tour de forces, and mainly coming from obscure sources. And we're trying to establish bases for decoding the New Testament. We went over a book that was called, this is all part of the Reciprocal Church. I believe this is episode 173 of the Reciprocal Church, where we're attempting to construct a pragmatic framework for spiritual practice, religion, so-called, what I would call reciprocal religion, one over religion. And that's kind of in tribute to Dewey B. Larson and his reciprocal system of theory, which we will be going over on, I've done almost 600 videos on it, but we will be going over it in this particular context here coming up pretty soon. But at least according to my research, the Western tradition is going to be needing some replacement practices, spiritual practices, as Christianity and Judaism become discredited, which is imminent because they are both false. And the research is out there, but it just hasn't seeped into the consciousness yet. It's pretty, especially for a red-pilled person, it should be pretty obvious that the New Testament is a Roman psyop. The whole thing was concocted by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty in the late 1st century, and they used many of their academics, especially some Jewish academics, to write the Gospels as a satire, to basically make fun of anybody who believes in this, but primarily to pacify the Jews, who had been a major pain in their butt for over a century, culminating in the War of the Jews in 66 AD, where the Jews tried to revolt away from the Roman colonial rule and managed to occupy the entire Roman army for almost 7 years, including wounding both Vespasian and Titus, who were the military generals that were leading the Roman army, and then both eventually became emperors. And those are two of the three, also the younger brother Domitian, who were in charge, or who decided to write the Gospels. And they had the motive, they had the means. They used that same method of operation to pacify the Jews in another way with what you call rabbinical Judaism. They used exactly the same techniques to pacify the Jews with that also. So it was kind of, and they weren't just trying to pacify Jews either. They were going after the Gentile slave class and, all of the hoi polloi. So it was done through the instrument of Josephus, who I'm not sure if he was a real person or not, but I usually just call him Team Josephus. But Josephus was, according to his autobiography, he was a Jew priest who eventually was appointed as one of the generals for the war against the Romans there in 66 AD. And he surrendered eventually to the Romans. He thought that the whole fight was folly, that they could never beat the Romans, and eventually he surrendered. And at a certain point, he had an epiphany that was, God has changed his favor from the Jews to the Romans. He has decided that he's now, the Romans are now the chosen people. And he's captured when he surrenders, and he is speaking with Vespasian, and he gives Vespasian the star prophecy, which is that I foresee that you will one day become emperor. And Vespasian, lo and behold, does one day become emperor, one day very soon after that. And he rewards Josephus by bringing him to the Roman court and adopting him as his son. And so Josephus was there. There were a number of other Jews there at the court, including Berenice, who was Titus's mistress, who was one of the Herod family. Herod was not a hereditary Jew, but he was a convert. And there was also Tiberius Alexander, who was one of the first. He was an Alexandrian Jew. So these are Hellenized Jews who they weren't like the Zealots. They weren't like xenophobic and everything about Israel. And, they were more cosmopolitan. They spoke Greek. They, they went through the gymnasium, the Greek and / Roman educational system. And he used these people to help him write both his books, which were called The War of the Jews, then his autobiography, and then also the Antiquities of the Jews, written between 75 and 95 AD. And at the same time that the Gospels were being written. Some people say that the Gospels may have been written earlier than that, but I don't believe so. I believe that they were written at the same time, and which could have been as early as 70 AD. Vespasian became emperor in 69 AD. And but the ancients used what you call typology or intertextual reading as a staple form of communication. So you can start to see that Josephus wrote the Gospels, Team Josephus wrote the Gospels, when you read the Gospels and War of the Jews at the same time. When you read them at the same time, you recognize that they follow parallel plots. And so you could say, well, Jesus came before Josephus, so Josephus was just copying Jesus. But the problem is that that Jesus made a number of prophecies in the New Testament, and all of those prophecies were fulfilled by Titus, the Roman emperor who was a general in the War of the Jews. The parallels involved are the 3-year ministry of Jesus and the 3-year military campaign of Titus. Titus was the son of Vespasian. Vespasian was the first general in that war, but then he became emperor after Nero killed himself, and they had 3 other emperors who lasted a total of 1 year. And then Vespasian came in 69 AD. He gave the reins over of the military to his son Titus. And so Titus fought the war for 3 more years. So those 3 years of Titus's military campaign are paralleled by the 3 years of Jesus's ministry. Every place that Jesus goes, Titus goes. When Jesus does something, that those events are paralleled by Titus. Generally, what happens is that Jesus gives a metaphorical saying that sounds like it's kind of got a spiritual or religious importance. And then in the War of the Jews, that statement that he made is fulfilled literally in War of the Jews. Not he's speaking in a figurative manner, but then in the War of the Jews, it appears as if he's speaking in a literal manner. The example that's I talked about it yesterday, but it's also relevant here, is where the first place that they go, Gennesareth on the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus meets Simon and Andrew and the fishing boat and convinces them to go follow him, or maybe doesn't convince them, but gets them to follow him. And he says, I will make you fishers of men. So you think, well, they were fishermen. And he's now saying they'll make you fishers of men, like you're going to convert people to our new religion. But then in that same location, the Sea of Galilee, in 70 AD, Titus and his men are fighting the Jews. And the Jews, when they fell into the water, they were afraid to stick their head out because they would be pierced with a dart or a spear. And the Romans were literally fishing for men. I believe the general at that, or the general for the Jews fighting against Titus in this battle, his name was Jesus. There in the War of the Jews, I believe there are 6 characters named Jesus. Also included in that, another parallel like that, is what Joseph Atwill, who is pretty much the author of the main thrust of what I'm talking about, in his book Caesar's Messiah, and also Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. Atwill calls it the woe-saying Jesus. And I believe it's Luke. I'm the book of Luke. I'm not sure where, but we're going to be going over this extensively in a little while. But I'm trying to just kind of maybe in a week or so. But I'm just trying to set the stage here. There's a chapter in Luke where Jesus is like, woe to blah, 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 and woe to you who blah, blah, blah. You know, he says woe several times in the same chapter. You probably know what I'm talking about. I'll be presenting it once I get all my notes together on that. But there's also a passage that occurs exactly 40 years, I believe 40 years to the day of when that is being said, which is being said by another character named Jesus in the War of the Jews, who is at Jerusalem, which is the same place that happened with Jesus. And you know, there's this war going on. The Romans are using their catapults, and they're, you know, catapulting giant rocks at the walls of Jerusalem, over the walls of Jerusalem, you know, and into the interior. And the character named Jesus is like, woe to this and woe to that. And woe, he does exactly the same thing that Jesus is doing. But then eventually and he's being beaten at the same time. He's being whipped at the same time, and it has no effect on him. And I think they actually took him away and they tortured him or something, and then it had no effect on him. And then finally at the very end he says, "And woe to me too." And at the very moment that he says that, a flying rock annihilates him and he dies. So that's part of War of the Jews. Now, Josephus is supposed to be a historian. This is supposed to be a history. And not only that, crucially, it is the only history that we have of the first century. Like, so all of the ancient scholarship going all the way back to that time, they use Josephus, he's the only source they have for everything, all the dating of the first century, all the activity of the first century. The only other sources are the Gospels themselves, which have been shown not to be reliable history. They contradict each other in numerous places, and they contradict other sources as well, like the tax sources and stuff from the Roman government. And then also now the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which were not discovered until the mid-20th century, in a bunch of caves near Qumran, near 20 miles from Jerusalem. They had uncovered about 800 different kinds of books there, including all of the Old Testament, different books of the Old Testament, except for Esther, and a number of the apocryphal books of the Old Testament, such as the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Enoch, and then also a lot of sectarian material that is unique, that was written by this sect of kind of very strict Jews. And it's hard to say whether they were warlike or whether they were peaceful, but they were very much into writing this stuff down. And I think they knew that their demise was coming, and they made these vases or jars to put the books in painstakingly. And so I think they knew that their gig was up. And anyway, they stashed them in these caves, and they stayed there for almost 1900 years. And they depict very much of a precursor or an anticipation of what's written in the Gospels. And they use much of the same language. We went last time through many of the different phrases that are used in the in some of these sectarian writings of the Dead Sea group, and how they compare with the New Testament. And so we're going to continue to do a little bit of that, and maybe talk a little bit more about the New Testament, or about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then eventually we're going to get back over to the typology. But I'm trying to give you several different ciphers so that you can look at your, New Testament, and you can suss this stuff out for yourself. So I was talking last time about how the priests there at Qumran is the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. They depicted their baptisms. Now, remember, baptism, we thought that was a Christian-only concept, but Well, maybe not, because I think this guy Hillel might have had some ideas about baptism too. I don't know if the Dead Sea Scrolls were before or after Hillel, and nobody else does either, because the Dead Sea Scrolls haven't been conclusively dated. Some say second century BC, some say first century BC, some say first century AD. And um, the priest who baptized, um, the baptism was for kind of the initiate, the first initiation, for people who are not tight with the church there, but that who were dipping their foot in the water, so to speak. Whereas the second initiation is the communion, the bread and the wine. And so when it says Jesus turned water into wine, it was because Jesus was in favor of opening up the church to the water. The baptism was really only for it was for everyone, whereas the second initiation was really for only people that had been put in a certain amount of time, but also only Jews. And so Jesus was opening up the second initiation, the communion, to non-Jews, and that was turning water into wine. So prior to that, the Gentiles were only able to become baptized, but now they're able to become communized or whatever, communion. So here we're looking at some of Barbara Thiering's work on the New Testament, on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Gentiles might receive baptism as fishes. Only Jews could become loaves, like the loaf as in bread, as in communion, as in bread and wine, and loaves as in fishes, and loaves as in Jesus has, they have the 5,000 people, and they've got 5 fishes and 12 loaves or whatever, and it's spread out between 5,000 people. Uncircumcised non-Jews of the Ham fraternity were known figuratively as the 5,000. So these are descendants of Ham, Noah's. That's usually thought of as being black Africans, but Noah's son, who was disgraced because he found Noah naked and drunk in his tent. So let's see, what else do we have here? The temple at Murd, the place where they had a monastery, it was referred to as the wilderness. Excommunication from the order was regarded as spiritual execution by decree, took 4 days. And you were excommunicated, you were dressed in a shroud, shut away, and held to be sick unto death. So these are all from the various sectarian documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, they have echoes in the New Testament, but they're written in these Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the mid-20th century. And they have, we don't exactly know how old they are. I personally believe they're from the 1st century AD, because they refer to a few battles that were in the 1st century, as opposed to the 1st century BC. There was a wives of the priests held the ranks of Elizabeth and Mary, respectively. So, and Atwill talks about that too. He believes that Mary, I believe there's like 7 Marys in the New Testament, and that Mary is a title, not a name. That it basically means rebellious Jew woman. Thiering, I believe, makes a distinction between a Mary and a Martha. A Martha can own property, and a Mary cannot. I'm not exactly remembering why. Well, I think we might come across that at a certain point. Thiering also says that I believe after Mark chapter 16. The second half of it is fraudulent, is what she says. Spuriously attached at a later date, the last 12 verses. The monastery at Qumran was also known as the Mount of Olives. Whenever they say without the gate, that means define various other unclean places, including ordinary cemeteries. The place of a skull was also a cemetery. Golgotha, which is, I believe, means skull, was an example, but not the only example. When they said Sodom in Egypt, this positively identifies the location as Qumran. And so in the hierarchy, so, in this, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's basically a character who's kind of like the founder of the sect, and he's called the Teacher of Righteousness. And he is opposed by both the wicked priest and the false prophet. And he has a new covenant for the people. And unlike Paul and to a lesser extent Jesus, the new covenant has to do with following the law, not with belief, not with faith, but with the strict following of the law. And that is the path of salvation. So, that is also what I believe James, the brother of Jesus, after Jesus' death, if you believe the whole story, that he was he wasn't off into Christianity. He was still a Jew. And he believed that, Jesus' message was that you got to follow the law. But Paul comes along and Paul, shirks that. But it's also shown that, and as we look at some of Michael Menescott's work, that Jesus really, when he talks about the Ten Commandments, he only lists 5 of them. So I think it's kind of a dilution of the law, where he talks about that. And I think Christianity in general is a strong dilution also of the principle of monotheism, because it's bringing in the Son and the Holy Spirit. And so it's, now you're talking about 3 gods, but they have this kind of idea that these are 3 gods, but they're really the same. So, they're able to maintain the name monotheism, but the concept is a little bit diluted. And then also, when you have that, when you have that monotheism, it also brings the concept of Satan along. The concept of Satan didn't really exist in the Old Testament. The Jews don't really have a strong concept of Satan. The word Satan is used only a handful of times in the Old Testament, and it is used as an obstacle or an adversary. There is no kind of supernatural vibe. I believe it's even used to address David. David is once used to be called Satan because he was an obstacle or an adversary, and that there's no hell, or there's no fire and brimstone. There's no pitch forks, or that's Hollywood. And to a lesser extent, it's probably, Paradise Lost and Dante, the 7 layers of hell, or whatever, 9 layers of hell, and but probably mostly Hollywood is where our conception of Satan comes from. I mean, it's in the New Testament to a certain extent. Jesus calls Peter Satan once, and but it's not really but it has to come out, because what you really get from the Old Testament to the New Testament is you get a better God. Like the God of the Old Testament is a God with a small g who has a whole array of personality disorders. He's jealous, and he's zealous, and he's angry, and he is obsessive compulsive, and he's addicted to smoked meat, and he's vengeful, wrathful, and all kinds of stuff. And he's arbitrary. He punishes the innocent all the time. And that's because that monotheism is more tight. And so it includes the concept of evil. But then when you get to the Christian Bible, the God is a lot better. But then you get the separation. It's an exorcism. And so you get Satan. And Satan has got all of those evil qualities. And now Satan is kind of unleashed. Prior to that, Satan was within the concept of God, but now Satan has some kind of sovereignty and doesn't just take instructions from God or whatever. Okay, so that was just an aside. We'll get into that more, though, because that does play a part here in some of the decoding, especially once we get to the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation is really the only part of the Bible where there is a huge emphasis on Satan, or imagery and stuff of a supernatural. Let's see. Now, what's interesting is that the people at Qumran, they followed a different calendar than the rest of the Jews. The Jews were on a lunar calendar. The Qumran sect was on a calendar that was more solar. It included 3 consecutive months, 3 quarters of 30, 30, and 31 days. So every day of the week was, well, I'll get into this tomorrow because it looks like we're going to be pretty much out of time here. We're moving slow, but we're picking it up, and we're going to get into some great stuff here. So hang on with me, and thanks for tuning in today.